Welcome back. In the previous video, we downloaded this level so we can have something a little bit more pleasing to look at while we're developing. So I'm going to find our player start. I'm going to select it and hit F to focus on it. And I'm going to go ahead and just delete this one. And we're going to find a nice quiet area that we can spawn our character in. So I found this little office area, and I decided to place the player start here. So once we start playing, we'll have this area, and there's still some ambient noise. So I went ahead and stopped recording the desktop audio so that you can just hear my voice and you don't have to worry about the noise. But for now, this will be a nice place for us to spawn when playtesting. Okay, so in this video, we're going to implement automatic fire. So when we press and hold the trigger, which is the left mouse button or the right trigger on the console controller, rather than shooting once, we're going to want to shoot many times very rapidly like an automatic weapon would do. To do that, we're going to make use of timers. Let's get started. Here we are in shooterCharacter.h, and I'm going to scroll down to the private section where we can add some private variables. Down here at the bottom, I'm going to want a Boolean for when our fire button is being pressed. So I'm going to create a bool called bFireButtonPressed. For the comment, I'll say left mouse button or right console trigger pressed. Now I'm also going to create a Boolean called bShouldFire. And this will be a Boolean that we'll use to know whether or not we should be firing a bullet. In other words, as soon as we've fired a bullet, we're going to start a timer, and during the duration of that timer, we should not be firing a bullet. But as soon as the timer is over, we can set this bool back to true so that we can fire again. So we'll say true when we can fire, false when waiting for the timer. Now we want to know how often we'd like to fire the weapon. So we're going to create a float called automatic fire rate. And this will tell us how many seconds should pass in between each bullet fire. So we're going to say rate of automatic gunfire. And finally, because we're using timers, we're going to create an ftimer handle, and we'll call this auto fire timer. And for the comment, we'll say sets a timer between gunshots. Now we're going to want to create functions that will set this fire button pressed Boolean, and we're going to bind these to the fire button. So let's create fire button pressed and fire button released functions, and we'll stick these up in the protected section. The first one will be void fire button pressed, and the next will be void fire button released. These function names are self-explanatory, so I'm not going to give these comments. Let's create function bodies for these. IntelliSense always has to think when it creates the second one. Okay, so we have the function definitions, and these are simply going to set the Boolean bFireButtonPressed to true for fire button pressed and bFireButtonPressed to false for fire button released. And now we can go down to setup player input component, and we can take our fire button bind action function call, and instead of calling fire weapon, we're going to call fire button pressed. So now pressing the left mouse button or the trigger on the console no longer results in fire weapon being called. Now we're simply setting this Boolean to true, so we're going to have to handle firing the weapon in a different way. We're going to copy this function call and paste it, and instead of IE pressed, we're going to use IE released, and we're going to call fire button released when the button is released. Okay, so we're going to be setting timers. So we'd like to have a function that can start the timer. So let's create a void function called start fire timer. And we're also going to want a function that gets called when the timer is complete. For this, we're going to create a function called void auto fire reset. And because it's going to be a callback for a timer, it needs to be a U function. So let's create bodies for these as well. Now for auto fire reset, all we're going to do is set B should fire to true. Now B should fire is the Boolean we're going to check to see if we should be firing the weapon. If it's false, we will not fire. So here's how it's going to work. Now, as soon as we call start fire timer, we're going to check to see if we should fire. So if B should fire, if we can fire, we're going to call fire weapon. That takes care of the actual firing of the weapon. Now, as soon as we've fired the weapon, we set B should fire to false. Now we can't fire anymore. Now, since we're firing the weapon, we're going to start the timer. So we're going to call get world timer manager and call the set timer function. And we're going to pass in auto fire timer. We'll put that on its own line. Next, we pass in this, as we can see by going to our 6th overload of the function, which takes the in object. Next is the function callback, for which we're going to use a shooter character auto fire reset. Finally, the delay time, which will be automatic fire rate. Now we're going to call start fire timer in the fire button pressed function. So here in fire button pressed, not only are we setting fire button pressed to true, we're also calling start fire timer as well. So fire button pressed calls start fire timer, which checks to see if we should fire. If B should fire is true, we fire the weapon and set B should fire to false. Then we start the timer, and we can't fire again until B should fire is true again. So if we press fire button pressed before the timer's over, we'll call start fire timer, but start fire timer will not make it inside B should fire. Now, as soon as the timer is done, we call auto fire reset, which sets should fire to true. But as soon as auto fire reset gets called, we should check to see if we're still pressing the fire button. So we can say if B fire button pressed, and if we're still holding the fire button down, we can start fire timer all over again. So call start fire timer. So if we continue to press the fire button, as soon as the timer finishes, auto fire reset will check to see if we're still pressing. If we are, we'll start the fire timer all over again, and so we'll continue to fire. Now, automatic fire rate needs to have a value. So let's go up to the constructor, and up here in the initializer list, let's add an initialization for it, and we'll start it off with 0.1 f for 0.1 seconds. And we'll comment this automatic gun fire rate. Now, something to keep in mind, this 0.1 seconds needs to be a larger value than the timer rate for interpolating for the crosshair spread. We need enough time between gunfire shots for the crosshairs to spread and shrink back. And remember, the crosshair spread timer uses 0.05, which is half of this value. So as soon as we fire, the crosshairs start spreading outward for 0.05 seconds and then begin to shrink back inward. And we won't fire another bullet for another 0.1 seconds after that. So just keep in mind that if you increase automatic fire rate, you have to increase that interpolation timer time for the gunfire spread factor. So let's take a look at everything that's going on here. So the first thing that happens is we press the left mouse button or the console trigger and fire button pressed gets called. Fire button pressed sets the Boolean fire button pressed to true and calls start fire timer. Start fire timer will first perform an if check to see if we should fire. If we succeed in that check, then fire the actual weapon by calling fire weapon. Set B should fire to false because we shouldn't be able to just press the button as fast as we want. We should have to wait for the fire timer to tell us we can fire again. We also start the timer. This gets the timer going, and we have to wait the number of seconds determined by automatic fire rate. Now, as soon as the timer finishes, then auto fire reset gets called because it's the callback for the timer. Auto fire reset sets B should fire to true again, and then performs a check to see if the fire button is still pressed. If the fire button is still held down, then we call start fire timer again, which again checks B should fire, which we just set to true in auto fire reset, which means we'll fire the weapon again, set B should fire to false, and start the timer. Once the timer finishes, we set B should fire to true again, check to see if the button is still pressed, and call start fire timer, and we'll continue doing this indefinitely until we release the fire button, which causes fire button released to be called, and that sets B fire button pressed to false. This means when auto fire reset gets called at the end of the timer, we check to see if fire button pressed is true, and it won't be, which means we'll stop calling start fire timer and the weapon will stop firing. So that's how we set up automatic fire. Now the last thing we need to do is give our Booleans default values. We have fire button pressed and should fire. Now here in the character constructor, up here at the bottom of our initializer list, we'll add B should fire, and its default value should be true. There's no reason you shouldn't be able to start firing the first time you press the button. But B fire button pressed should be false by default because we don't start off pressing it until the button gets clicked. I'll go ahead and consider this its own section of the initializer list, and we'll change the comment to say automatic fire variables. So now that we've initialized our variables, let's compile, and we're back in the editor. I went ahead and turned on desktop audio so we can hear this. We're going to give this a try. And there we have it. We have automatic fire. So to summarize, in this video, we created the variables and functions necessary for automatic fire. In the next video, we're going to implement jumping and make sure that we play the correct animations for jumping by taking care of that in our animation blueprint.